Few men knew the ex-president and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results more than his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Meadows was with him on January the 6th. Meadows was on that infamous call with the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Meadows pressured the DOJ to investigate voter fraud conspiracy theories like Italygate. Meadows even went down to Georgia in December of 2020 to observe an audit of absentee ballots. Meadows, along with his former boss, was one of the 19 individuals indicted in Fulton County DA Fani Willis's racketeering case. And new reporting in The Guardian finds that, according to two people familiar with the matter, prosecutors do not intend to offer plea deals to Trump and at least two other high-level co-defendants. The two they point to, Meadows and Trump's former lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. From that reporting, quote, the previously unreported decision has not been communicated formally and could still change, for instance, if prosecutors shift strategy. But it signals who prosecutors consider their main targets and how they want to wield the power of Georgia's racketeering statute to their advantage, end quote. Out of the 19 indicted in this case, 4 have already pleaded guilty. Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, Kenneth Chesbrough, and Scott Hall. As The Guardian notes, quote, the plea deals underscore the strategy that Willis has refined over successive RICO prosecutions, extending offers to lower-level defendants in which they plead guilty to key crimes and incriminate higher-level defendants in the conspiracy pyramid, end quote. Now, this development out of Fulton County comes as another state case involving the ex-president is moving along. Today, on the stand in the New York civil fraud trial were witnesses associated with Deutsche Bank, the largest lender to Trump's businesses, defending the bank's decision to let the Trump organization borrow money. Just yesterday, we learned from Trump's lawyers that the former president will take the stand in his own defense next month. He will be the defense's last witness, and that is scheduled for December the 11th. And that's where we start this hour with MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin here with me at the table. Plus, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former United States Attorney Harry Litman and New York Times investigative reporter Suzanne Craig is back. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Suzanne, I want to start, before I talk to Lisa about what the Deutsche Bank folks had to say, I want to ask you, because you are the repository of all information about this, about Deutsche Bank and the relationship to Donald Trump and his companies and the financing that they provided. Why is this even relevant or unusual?
Right. I mean, you can't, when you think about Donald Trump and his money for many years, you have to think about Deutsche Bank. They were his biggest lender for years, and they've loaned to some of his biggest projects. When you think the old post office hotel in Washington the Trump family recently sold, they were the biggest lender on that. They were the lender on Doral, which is a golf course just outside of Miami. They were also right in the middle of the Chicago project. There's a huge hotel that Donald Trump built in the 2000s, and they were the lender on that. And that was his last actual full project that he built from the ground up. So Deutsche Bank is very intertwined with the Trump family, and it's all sort of now coming to the forefront in a courtroom in Manhattan, because a number of these loans are now under the microscope by the Attorney General in New York. And when you think about it, this week was interesting, and I know we're going to talk to Lisa a lot more about what happened today in the court, but you have to think, in terms of this trial, they're his biggest lender, in a way his biggest victim as well. And they came forward today to say, I think in some, that these loans, they are all performing, and we didn't, and Deutsche Bank executives were saying we didn't necessarily fully rely on them. We did our own due diligence on these loans and went ahead with our own metrics and made the loan. And that's one of Donald Trump's key points, is that, hey, these guys did their own due diligence. They're big banks, and they're big players, and they're responsible for doing their own due diligence, and they did.
So they're under the microscope in large part because there's an actual trial, but in large part because of the reporting that Suzanne Craig and her team did that brought much of this to attention. We've all, as Suzanne says, when you think about Donald Trump and money and loans, most people asked for a second beat will think about Deutsche Bank. What'd they say today? What's their position on this?
You know, they talked about, as Suzanne mentioned, they talked about the process that they went through in deciding to loan to Donald Trump. There was a process, and they did do some degree of due diligence. But on cross-examination, they were also forced to admit that their due diligence was by necessity limited. If the client isn't presenting to you accurate information in the first place, then your efforts to confirm that information are going to be lacking in some respects. They also talked about their willingness to grant Trump more favorable terms because of their perception of his net worth. They thought, and one of the witnesses today testified, that he had $100 million in liquidity. That's something that I think experts on Trump might question. And then, of course, there's the issue of when the bank terminated its relationship with Donald Trump. And today's witnesses weren't really able to testify to why that happened. But tomorrow we're expecting to see Rosemary Vlaic. She was the senior Deutsche Bank banker with whom the Trump family dealt, initially introduced to them by Jared Kushner. When we get to the part of why Deutsche Bank stopped extending credit to Donald Trump, she's the one who can tell that story. And I expect that won't be a helpful one to Donald Trump, because even if the loans performed, even if Deutsche Bank was happy, they ultimately decided that they weren't going to continue doing business with him. And there was a reason why.
What can you tell us about that, Suzanne?
Well, right when Lisa said it, came to mind also that just because the loans were performing doesn't mean that laws weren't violated. And I think that we're going to see, you know, as the course of this plays out, and I think in closing arguments, you're going to hear talk about that. These loans could have been performing. Deutsche Bank did make millions of dollars off of them, but they could have made more, and laws could have been broken. And I think that that's sort of what the residue that I come away from Deutsche Bank, the various testimony that I've been reading about this week and sort of following Lisa's while she's been down there.
If I had to summarize what happened this week in 6 words, it would go: no harm, no foul from the Trump people.
Right.
And then so what from the Attorney General, for the reasons that Suzanne just mentioned. Just because the bank didn't lose money doesn't mean it could have made more. But also the Attorney General has expressed an interest in sort of vindicating the interests of all of us in New York who need to access financial markets. If people like Donald Trump can mess with the integrity of the markets, then it's certainly not
It's not
safe.
a victimless crime.
Correct. And their position is, not only was Deutsche Bank a victim, even if it doesn't see itself that way, but we're all victims of a corrupted market.
Hey, Harry Litman, let's talk about Georgia for a minute. This whole reporting in The Guardian that says they're not looking at making a deal with Rudy Giuliani or Mark Meadows. Now, in 50 years, when we look back at this, if Donald Trump is convicted for something, that'll be the only story. Nobody's going to care about Mark Meadows, whether he was convicted or wasn't convicted, and maybe people will care about Rudy Giuliani. I don't know. Is that real that they're not going to make a deal with them, or are they just telling them that so that Meadows can sit there and say, oh, my God, I'm going to have to offer them something really good for them to make a deal with me?
I think what's real is they haven't offered it to date, and I'm not actually sure, Ali, when we think back on Watergate, we do look to Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
Well, that's a good point.
That really is who Meadows and Giuliani is here. We also need to remember this amalgamation of 2 cases, and Fani Willis is an elected prosecutor. On the one hand, there are people who came from Washington and made mischief, and Giuliani and Meadows are top of the list, as you say. And then there are political officials within Georgia who didn't comply with their duties. And I think you may see a whole series of pleas leading up to David Schaefer, who's the most guilty person among the local Georgia electors. But sure, prosecutors draw lines like this, and if they have drawn it, in particular, Giuliani is in tremendously bad shape. He has no money, and really he would have to go through the exercise, pay for the exercise, only to get a very little bit of time off for, at best, if he admits his guilt. This is especially bad news for him today if it's true. We knew it about Trump. We had a pretty good idea about Meadows, who still has legal claims. It is a body blow to Giuliani.
Let's talk about that, the difference between Trump, Giuliani, and Meadows in this whole thing, because obviously Fani Willis and Jack Smith want to get at Donald Trump. Rudy Giuliani, what's the difference in what Rudy Giuliani is to this case and what Mark Meadows is to this case?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I mean, I think Mark Mark Meadows was further away from the sort of granular evidence collecting that Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, and some of the others were involved in. But Rudy Giuliani is also connective tissue in a way that Mark Meadows is not. Anna Bauer at Lawfare, who Harry and I know from her reporting about the Fulton County case, today connected some social media posts about a meeting that happened at the Willard Hotel with Kathy Latham, who is one of the defendants in this case who has not yet pled out, is said to have been involved in the Coffee County voting machine scheme. And the story that Anna is telling is she met that day at the Willard Hotel with Rudy Giuliani, took pictures with Sidney Powell and Mike Flynn, and then that night, those folks went to the White House, had that infamous meeting with Trump that got kind of crazy, right, out of control, where they talked about an executive order to seize the voting machines. So when I think about Rudy Giuliani, I think about a person whose hands were sort of in all of the cookie jars, right? And the fake electors scheme, and the Coffee County voting machine breach, and in communicating directly with Trump. Meadows was at somewhat of a remove. On the other hand, what he allowed to happen and what he encouraged to happen, and the way in which he talked to both sides, trying to encourage Team Normal that he was with them, encourage Team Crazy that he was with them, different in degrees and in kind, Allie.